Greetings, APUSH scholars, coming to you once again from the high school library here, and this is the review for APUSH Unit 7 on the Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm looking at the review sheet from top to bottom and the Confederacy and states' rights. The idea of states' rights, we've been going over this for quite a while now, and this is the idea that the states have kept their sovereignty after creating the United States after the Constitutional Convention in 1788. And this idea involves the idea that a state can decide on the constitutionality of a federal law, and they can choose to strike it down, they can choose to nullify it. And you see this concern in the very Constitutional Convention between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You see Virginia and Kentucky striking down the Alien and Sedition Acts during the Adams administration. You see this argument in the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, where the northern states are in opposition to the New England Federalists, and more specifically are in opposition to this war, and they're talking secession. You have the Exposition and Protest essay by John C. Calhoun in the 1830s, talking about how South Carolina can nullify the Tariff of Abominations. So there's this long history here of states saying that they can pull rank on the U.S. government when they are in disagreement. And this is also known as the compact theory, the idea that it is the states that made the United States and the states can unmake it, thus the Confederacy being created in 1860 in the wake of Lincoln's election. And one of the most famous opponents of this idea is Daniel Webster in the Hayne-Webster debate. And remember, Mr. Hayne argued that this compact theory that the states made the Union, and Daniel Webster is saying, no, the Union is made by the people themselves, and the Union therefore can't just be dissolved at the whim of any state. Northern advantages during the war, you have a big list in your notes here: more factories, more railroads, there's more money, more banks, larger population, more men available to fight, there's more immigrants, just more of everything except for better generalship in the early years of the war. The outbreak of the war, Fort Sumter is fired upon by the South Carolinians, and the cause here is both the United States and South Carolina are claiming this federal fort that's on this island in Charleston Harbor. And Lincoln refuses to vacate the fort. He is sending in ships that have non-military supplies, namely food, and after a little longer than a day bombardment, Major Anderson pulls down the flag, and he's allowed to leave and go back to the north, and South Carolina takes over Fort Sumter. So this is the starting episode of the war between the states, as the South calls it, and the Civil War, as it's known by the North. The border states are those states, those four states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which have slavery but which do not join the Confederacy. They stay with the North. And Lincoln has to do this tiptoe dance in keeping them and not alienating them so that they'll join the South. Lincoln and civil rights. The AP has asked several times some questions on civil rights during warfare, and we just mentioned here John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. But Lincoln, because Washington, D.C. is surrounded by both Virginia and mostly Maryland here, he is going to suspend habeas corpus, which is going to allow him to arrest some Maryland politicians and newspaper editors and journalists who are of suspect or disloyalty. And he does this so that he can protect the Capitol. This is not across the country. It's not widespread, but he gets criticism in the history books, which is a little bit perhaps unfair in that the history books don't mention that Jefferson Davis also suspended habeas corpus as well. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by Lincoln will free the slaves in rebel areas behind enemy lines. It does not free the slaves in the border states. And it doesn't free slaves in southern Louisiana, which is liberated by Admiral Farragut early in the war. So this is meant to be a war measure to disrupt the southern economy, but it's not a freeing of all the slaves. Now, Lincoln will be pushing for the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery once the war is over. And this will be one of the requirements for southern states wanting readmission to come in. In the Emancipation Proclamation, there's a real short little paragraph about how black soldiers are now free to enlist. And you should know about the timing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It comes on the heels of the Northern win, quote unquote win. It's kind of a stalemate, but Lee, who's invaded Maryland, he wants to take the war to the North. He wants to disillusion the North. After this bloody conflict, the bloodiest single day of the war, the bloodiest battle is Gettysburg, but the bloodiest single day of the war, the Southern troops under Lee will withdraw, and this is seen as a defeat. And Lincoln feels confident that he can issue this Emancipation Proclamation not as an act of desperation, but one from a position of strength. And what's significant here is Lee was hoping, as far as foreign relations go, Lee was hoping to sort of pull off a Saratoga where, remember, the French see that, oh, the Americans are strong enough to hold their own, so they gave us aid. Lee was hoping if he could defeat the Northerners at Antietam, that he could convince the Brits to provide diplomatic recognition and military aid. And the Brits who are watching this see that the Confederates can do no such thing. So the South does not get official government recognition. Keep in mind, the English/British government will be selling weapons to the South and building ships, but this is on a pay basis. Treatment of black soldiers by the Confederacy, very harsh. Davis orders enslavement of all black soldiers captured, and all blacks in any area captured, free blacks by any area captured by, invaded by the Confederate Army. And in reality, Southern troops butchered Union black soldiers when they were captured. As far as immigration goes, immigration continues. Almost 1 million immigrants enter the North, maybe more like 800,000, enter the North during the war, and significant numbers of them will enlist and will be conscripted, notably the Irish. And this is not an advantage that the South has during the war. As far as conscription goes, there is a conscription act in both the North and in the South. And the reaction in New York City to this is very violent. There's the biggest riot for 100 years in American history, 3 days of rioting in New York City by mostly Irish immigrants against free blacks, the poor attacking the poor. Basically, the Irish are protesting that they have to go off and fight and die to free blacks who are stealing food from their families' mouths, competing for these scarce, low-paying jobs in New York City. And the Irish are very, they're angry about this, and they're going to kill about 120 blacks. They're going to burn orphanages and churches and hunt blacks down and kill them in the streets. And the contingent of the U.S. Army after Gettysburg is shipped up to New York to suppress this city insurrection. We already just went over the Battle of Antietam next on the review sheet, and this is the battle that both allows Lincoln to pursue the Emancipation Proclamation from a position of strength, and it also knocks out any chance that England will recognize Southern independence. Trent Affair is early in the war. The Union Navy stops a British ship and pulls off 2 Confederate diplomats, and this is seen as a violation of neutrality of the seas by the English, and they're threatening to send soldiers to pressure us in Canada. And Lincoln sort of he submits. He gives these diplomats back, sends them across the border into Canada, and avoids a war with England. But what you see here is that early on in the war, this is not a war of liberating the slaves. And the English aristocracy is much more sympathetic to the South. And the English have abolished slavery in the 1830s, and the North is not saying anything about abolishing slavery. So, the North, as the economic rivals of the Brits, are not, they're not the side that's favored here. King Cotton is this idea that cotton is supreme, that cotton gives the South this advantage, that in 1857, when there's this panic, this depression that hits the North and shuts down factories and causes runs on banks, the South is not hit as badly. And the South is feeling very confident that they have the ace in their hand. And one of the things they sort of in a blunder, what they do is they're going to embargo the sale of cotton to Great Britain to force Great Britain to recognize them. And Britain's going to outsource, it's going to find their source of cotton here in Egypt and India, and they're not going to need the South. They're going to avoid war. One thing that the Brits do need is northern grain. The Brits don't grow enough grain to feed themselves, and they need northern grain actually more than they need southern cotton And with the South unable to come up with a win like in Antietam, the Southern failure, the South is not convincing anyone that their economy is invulnerable. On top of this here, the South is going to suffer rampant inflation, and the Southern economy is going to shrink while the Northern economy correspondingly booms. And inflation is going to destroy the value of the Confederate dollar, and there's going to be food shortages, there's going to be hunger, there's going to be bread riots in major southern cities because of a shortage of food, which is very ironic considering the South is agricultural, but most of their crops are export crops. They're cash crops, such as cotton, and you can't eat cotton. The reason why the North is fighting the war at its onset is to restore, is to maintain the Union. It's only after January 1, 1863, that there's now this additional cause, and that's human liberation, the liberation of the slaves. The Monitor and the Merrimack, these are these two ironclads, which are going to sort of change the sort of technology of naval warfare, going from wooden-hulled ships to these Ironsides, these ironclads. Copperheads is the nickname for Northerners who are sympathetic to the South. A number of reasons why a Northerner might be sympathetic to the South, or maybe we should say it a little differently, against the war or against the Republican Party or against Lincoln. One is disagreement over slavery, racism, lack of sympathy for fighting a war to stop slavery, tremendous fear that waves of slaves will move north and compete with free white labor. There is frustration over the loss of trade, natural trading partners. If you're in Ohio and across the river is Kentucky, this trade has been, well, that's not a good example. Kentucky is actually a border state in the north, but the idea here is states that are, maybe Kentucky and Tennessee, states that are bordering each other, that are natural markets for northern products, have been legally shut off. There's disagreement over the size of government. Remember, the Republicans have a number of these initiatives: Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, which is setting up agricultural universities in the West. A number of things here, a high tariff. The Republicans are the party of larger government, and there's some other things that sort of don't get as much attention, but are concerns of many people in the North. Remember, the Democrats, if they had stayed united in 1860, would have won the election. So there are Northern Democrats who are for, most are for fighting the war, but they're not necessarily at all in favor of Lincoln and his government. There's tremendous frustration over very poor military leadership and military losses, horrible losses, bloody losses, and this is laid at the feet of Abraham Lincoln. Treatment of blacks in the South after the war. Okay, now we're looking a little bit at Reconstruction here. Politically, from 1865 to 77, you get the short window with the Northern Army in the South. Blacks will run for office at both state government and some positions in the federal government in Washington, D.C. After the Compromise of 1877, blacks will be forced out of government. They won't be able to vote. They won't be able to serve in office. They'll be kept from voting. Now you can vote according to the 15th Amendment, but every state can make the rules which people are eligible to vote, as far as paying a poll tax, as far as a literacy test, grandfather clauses, and of course the threat of the Ku Klux Klan. These will keep blacks and a handful of poor whites from voting. As far as social treatment of blacks, there is Jim Crow. Jim Crow is the nickname for segregation. You'll have blacks are not attending white schools, and they can't sit on white benches in train stations. They can't sit next to white in train cars. They can't use white beaches, and they can't use white public facilities, and they can't sit together with whites in theaters, and the list goes on and on. These are really a continuation of the slave codes. And in addition here, let's jump down to economics here, just a thought here. Because the free blacks do not have land, they are going to sharecrop. And sharecrop is you're working on somebody else's land for a share of the crop. So blacks are put in a position of economic dependence. On top of this, it becomes a crime if you don't have a job, if you are a vagrant, and you can be forced to work off your fine, your punishment. And you have large numbers of blacks who are farmed out to plantations and to lumber and woods and to work in in various businesses as punishment for being unemployed, for being vagrants, for being landless. And in Florida, where this is coming from here, after the war, if you don't have a job and you're unemployed and you're a vagrant, this is a felony crime. And still to this day in Florida, if you have a felony conviction, you will not vote short of a pardon from the governor. And there are hundreds of thousands of Floridians today who cannot vote, most of them Black Americans. And at this time, this is one more means of keeping blacks from voting. So you have the deck being stacked against the quote-unquote supposedly free men through political exclusion, through social discrimination, and through economic dependence. Presidential versus congressional Reconstruction. Remember, President Lincoln and then later Johnson are going for the 10% rule. 10% of eligible Southern voters in 1860, if they will take an oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, you're good to come back if you ratify the 13th Amendment. Congressional Reconstruction is asking for a much stiffer requirement, and that's the ironclad 50% oath. And on top of this, you can't vote if you are a former Confederate officer, soldier, government member. And what's going to happen is for a long time, basically white Southerners are going to be kept from voting. And who's voting? Southern Unionists, nicknamed scallywags, Northerners who come south called carpetbaggers, and the black population. So congressional Reconstruction is much stricter, much harsher, much more vindictive. Military black radical Reconstruction, these are all synonyms for the same thing. The South, after Lincoln dies, the South is going to be sending. Now, they're going to follow the Lincoln plan. That's the one that 10% and you're in. Hey, let's go ahead and do that. When the Southern delegates make it to Washington, D.C., it turns out that the South has unrepentantly sent many ex-Confederates, many ex-Confederate officers and generals and men who had been in Washington and had violated their oath to uphold the Constitution and joining the Confederacy. And you even have Alexander Stephens, who's the former vice president of the Confederacy, all showing up expecting to be seated with their Northern Democratic counterparts, and they're shut out. The Northern Republicans have no intention of letting them sit. And they undo many of these Southern state governments, which followed the plan, the promise of President Lincoln and then Johnson, and they're put under military rule. There's 5 military districts, and what they have to do is these states have to pass new constitutions, and the 13th Amendment has to be passed, and the 14th Amendment has to be passed to come in. And the 14th Amendment does 2 things. It gives citizenship rights to the black citizens of the South, and it excludes former Confederates. Now, Johnson, when he's in office, is going to issue a mass amnesty for ex-Confederates, so this is not going to be a point eventually. But this is a much harsher plan, and making sure you don't get ex-Confederates. This is the radical Reconstruction, to make sure you don't get ex-Confederates heading up to Washington, and to make sure blacks get to vote, and to keep ex-Confederates from voting in the South. Governance of the South. This is the people who've come to office here under this 10% rule are going to alienate these Northerners, and some of them don't want the Southerners showing up because they don't want them to unite with the Northern Democrats. Others are truly alarmed at the ill treatment of the freed men. They're basically being turned into serfs as if slavery had never ended. Andrew Johnson is an interesting successor to Lincoln. He comes into office not very popular. He is a Southerner, he is a Democrat, and he is a states' writer. He doesn't believe in secession, but he's a states' writer. He's virulently racist. And the question is, how does this guy come into office? What's he doing as the vice president of Lincoln? Remember, Lincoln was not confident that he was going to win the 1864 election. So the Republican Party is renamed the Union Party. I mean, everybody knows that they're the Republicans. But Hannibal Hamlin, who was the vice president in 1860, is given the heave-ho, and Johnson is put on the ticket to win votes from Democrats and from the border states. And Lincoln does win the election, but after he's assassinated, Johnson comes into office, and he is an opponent to radical, harsh Reconstruction or congressional Reconstruction. And he's going to veto the Freedmen's Bureau, which will be passed over his veto. He's going to veto the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which is the predecessor to the 14th Amendment. The 1866 Civil Rights Act gives citizenship to the black freedmen, and he will veto this, and it will be overridden. So Johnson is this guy who's very unpopular, and the Congress wants to keep in Lincoln's cabinet, and Johnson wants his own people, and the particular person who Johnson wants out is Edwin Stanton, who is the Secretary of War, who's essentially in charge of the military in the South, and Johnson will fire him in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which is passed over Johnson's veto, which says that Johnson can't fire his cabinet. So Johnson will be impeached because he violates a federal law saying he can't fire his cabinet without congressional approval. Impeachment is a charging of the president, not an eviction, not a removal. Impeachment happens in the House, simple majority. It goes to the Senate. You need a two-thirds majority to kick the president out. And it's one vote shy of removing Johnson. And the result here is a lame duck presidency. His vetoes are overridden again and again and again. And he's considered one of the weakest presidents in American history. And while he was in office, he opposed the Freedmen's Bureau, opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He opposed the 14th Amendment. In fact, he goes on a speaking tour in the South to oppose the 14th Amendment, which the Congress is requiring the South to pass to come back in as a state. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is this precursor to the 14th Amendment, and Johnson's reaction was to veto it. And the last thing on your review sheet, you should know the three civil rights amendments. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment gives full citizenship to blacks, and to emphasize that the citizenship includes voting, that's the 15th Amendment. There's some other pieces here of the 14th Amendment that are interesting, namely that ex-Confederate officials cannot vote. But this will be done. This will end with the very generous amnesties and pardons that are pardons and then a blanket amnesty that's given by Johnson before he leaves office. So there you have it. Be sure to have read your book, underline, write that up, look at another voice in your head. Please look over your notes and your past quizzes here. And everything that's on this review sheet reflects something that will be on the test. So look this over and know the stuff called. All right, gang, good luck. See you soon. Bye.